Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Market Watch. Travel and tourism industry is a vital cogwheel of the overall Sri Lankan economy, a critical sector which creates job opportunities, drives visitor exports and boosts investments and eventually generates prosperity across the country. And this industry has contributed 11.4% to the overall GDP during 2016, and it is expected to rise by 5.5% during 2017 according to World Travel and Tourism Council report. So also further, the Sri Lankan tourism targets over 4.5 million tourist arrivals by 2020 compared to approximately 2 million during 2016. So to understand the dynamics, the challenges and growing trends of the industry, we invited Travis Gomez, product head of Frontier Group, to have an in-depth view about the industry. We are so pleased to have you with us today, Travis.
Thank you, glad to be here.
Travis, to start with, can you give us a brief overview of the overall performance of the travel and tourism industry compared to previous year?
Okay, yeah. So if you look at in terms of the listed hotel operators, the more formal sector, what we've seen is that they've basically been facing a more challenging time. And actually, if you look at their June 2017 performance on a 12-month trading basis, almost the earnings were down by almost 20%. Broadly, there are, I would say, at least two reasons for that. One was there was a bit of a seasonal impact because of the weather-related issues. So in the June quarter, because of the flooding and some of the weather-related issues, there were some cancellations that happened. So as a result, the occupancy levels were not what they expected. But even though what we've seen is that this seems to be now like a recurring pattern. Even last year, there was like a similar situation. So we are expecting that to continue. But at a more broader level, what we are seeing is that there's been a significant growth in terms of the competition that is there. So as a result, that's placing pressure on the ARRs, the average room revenues of the hotel operators, and as a result, occupancy is also affected because they are facing much more competition from both the formal hotel sector as well as the growing informal hotel sectors. So and I guess the final issue is also in terms of the cost increases. So because of a lot of this competition that is going on, basically everyone's on the hunt for like having like a very skilled labor in this segment. So as a result, there is talk of whether there's a shortage or not. As a result, what we've seen is that a lot of the margins of these hotels have been contracting. And an additional thing we saw with our analysis is that what we had previously observed was that a lot of the city hotels typically tend to outperform most of the other segments because they can cater to both the local demand in terms of the restaurants and the banqueting facilities, plus the visiting, like the business tourists who typically tend to spend more. But even now what we've seen is that their margins have also been coming more in line with the industry average. So they are also facing quite a challenging time. So overall, I would say it's challenging, and even looking ahead for the second half of their financial year, I think that will more or less continue. Even though we're entering into the peak tourism period, it's still going to be relatively challenging.
Okay, as you mentioned, challenging, Travis, I'm curious to know what would be the key challenges for the industry, as you mentioned earlier also, I mean the weather conditions,
yes.
And also if I can see more on the global spending power, and how is also the awareness about this and the cost side. Can you elaborate a little more on that, please?
Yeah, so in terms of global spending and in terms of our appeal to a global audience, that's where I think we face a lot of the key challenges, especially for the formal hotel operating segment, because what we are seeing is there is this shift that is happening in tourism in terms of the arrivals mix. Because previously a lot of tourism was dominated by Western Europe, a lot of visitors from France, from Germany, and as a result, a lot of the hotels were concentrated in the south because given their interest, basically what the hotel operators call the main appeal of Sri Lanka at that time was the sun, sand and beach, as they would put it. So but now what we are seeing is there's been a shift with more visitors coming from the Asian region. So if you take the Asian region as a whole, I think in 2016, about like 47% of the tourist arrivals were from the Asian region. So, and out of that, it's led by China and India.
Okay.
So because of that, some of the research we have done also points out that there is a shift in terms of the type of activities that they are interested in, the sort of, so having like that sun, sand and beach model may not be the way forward, or it may not be the only thing that they had to focus on, because what we are seeing is, and some of the research we've also done is that a lot of what we would call experiential tourism. So for example, when it comes to like historical walks and going on to Sigiriya, to the cultural triangle, and also a bit of shopping, and I think those are the aspects that a lot of the new tourists that are coming in, that's what they're seeing. They want to get this sort of experience. So as a result, actually looking at even the data in 2016, we saw there was like I think like a 48% increase in the arrivals for what we call the cultural triangle, this experiential tourism. So that's what's happening on that aspect. In terms of the tourist arrivals, there is this shift. At the same time, in terms of global spending, I think that's also favorable, because I think what some of the global reports have also been talking about is that when it comes to especially China, there's been a very significant growth, and even in the past couple of years. So I think some of the global reports are saying it's somewhat slowing. There's a bit of a cooling down happening compared to what it was, but still it's quite a significant growth, and very much it's going to be driven by China. And now what's coming up is also India. There's a lot of like demand from there as well. So I think from the global point of view, I think we can still sustain this level of strong tourist arrivals coming in, even though there has been somewhat of a slowdown this year. It's more to do with, I think, seasonal, like weather related issues, rather than so we feel that this as in the arrivals can be sustained. In terms of your second point about awareness, I think something interesting that we observed was that I think the overall awareness of Sri Lanka has definitely improved, and there is a lot of interest in it. But what we found an interesting aspect is, so for example, if you take most other tourist destinations, the capital city is like a big draw for most tourists. If it's like Athens, or if it's Rome, anywhere, the capital city tends to be the like a focal point for a lot. But what we see in Sri Lanka is, if you look at like some of the travel sites like booking.com or TripAdvisor, when you look at like their top 10 things to do in Sri Lanka, Colombo does not really feature very prominently. But in terms of, so we sort of like tried to figure out why this was, because actually it's not because there is like a lack of things to do in Colombo. There's a lot of, like, given the history of Colombo, given the sort of, there's a variety of things that would be of interest to people. So one is, I think one reason maybe because it hasn't been positioned properly, and people are not really aware of the type of activities that are there, and that plus also I think because of that lack of awareness, people have been going to other areas, because what we've seen is that so previously people came to Colombo for their transit purposes, to to stay, to basically to go to and from the airport. But now with the highways and with the expressways opening up, there's now less of a need for people to even spend time in Colombo. So we've actually seen that the sort of, although the overall number of nights that tourists spend in Colombo has been going up. I think it's now like about 10 nights for like foreign guest night. Colombo has kind of like, it's been like stagnant, or it's been slightly declining. So I think that's something that you really need to change, because I think a lot of hotel operators, what they've also been telling is that because the type of tourists that you attract to the city are the high, typically because there's a whole gamut of activities that are there in the city. You can have shopping, there's like restaurants, there's museums. So it's going to create a lot of like positive externalities if you get more people to Colombo, and as a result you can improve the tourist earnings as well, which has been lagging the tourist arrivals.
And also, Travis, I think you mentioned the shift, basically the experience should change. So can you give us an idea on what are the developing trends within the industry? Like we know about this interest for MICE tourism, then adventure tourism, ecotourism. What would be the trends if you can give us an idea on that?
Okay, so I think one aspect, so I mean Sri Lanka basically is blessed to have can pretty much cater to all of these different types of tourist. So you have the historical side, then you have the the hill country and the cool climate. You have the ones who want adventure. You have all the whitewater rafting. You have the snorkeling. You have all of those aspects. So I think in terms of some of the data we have, what we've seen is that I guess like a small example of that would be there's been much more stronger growth in things like people going to like Yala, to like the safari. Those kind of experiential activities has been growing, whereas it has been somewhat slower for like things like going to more like what would have been like previously like formal attractions like the Dehiwala Zoo or the Pinnavala. Those, I think people are more interested in that kind of like adventure sort of like safari when it comes to in that area. So similar trend with the cultural tourism as well. I think there's still very strong growth for like Sigiriya and Anuradhapura Polonnaruwa. There's been very strong growth over there. So I think in 2016, I think from 2015 to 2016, there was a significant jump in the number of tourists that arrived. So 2015, I think the number was like 350,000. It had jumped to like close to like 900,000 in 2016. So there is very strong growth in that segment. But what we see, the sort of underlying problem though there is, a lot of this is very much concentrated in a few activities. So for example, I think within the cultural segment, what you've seen is Sigiriya accounts for like 62% of the tourists that go for those type of activities. Similarly, when it comes to like the safaris, that type of activities, I think like 35% is from Yala. So actually what some of even the hotel operators have been saying is that those sort of travel itineraries that the tourists have been following, they haven't really changed in the last 10-20 years. So as a result, that's also causing these problems of overcrowding, particularly at Sigiriya, at Yala, you have these stories of animals getting knocked down, things like that. So I think that's an area to act. So what they should understand is that this kind of growth is going to continue. People are going to demand more and more of this type of activities, but the important thing is to kind of balance that, do this in a sustainable way so that it doesn't spoil the resource that we're depending on.
Travis, the growing demand, we know, even they're expecting a 5.5% growth during 2017 and also more tourists to arrive by 2020. Capacity, are we ready to cater this? And again, also if you can touch on the affordability compared to regional markets like Malaysia, Thailand, Maldives, what is our situation?
I think in terms of the capacity, there's definitely a lot of development. I think from 2010 to about 2014, I think there was a lot of new hotels, a lot of new, like if you talk about first the formal hotel sector, a lot of them were concentrated in the southern province, and there was a lot of investments that went in there. But now more recently, what we are seeing is much more activity in Colombo itself. So a lot of city hotels, a lot like the branded hotels are now coming in. So I think in the next 2 to 3 years, there's a lot of new. I think the highest capacity increase is coming from Colombo. I guess that tying in with the developments that are going to happen with the port city and all of that. So I think they are very much. I think the capital is very much gearing up towards like attracting particularly like more like MICE tourists, and for people to come here and to like have conferences, and you also have these international hotels here, so they're very much gearing up for that. And in other places also what we've seen is that even in segments where there hasn't been a lot of like formal hotels going and setting up in certain areas, what we've seen is that there's been a significant growth in the informal sector, with especially with these online platforms like Airbnb. What we've seen is that in a lot of, particularly in like the central province, there's a lot of new accommodation that is coming up there on an informal basis. So that is really catering to that I think more or less caters to the supply side of things. In terms of affordability though, there's a bit of a question when it comes to the formal sector. So I think that has always been a question that has been around compared to other tourist destinations in the area like Thailand and places like that, whether comparatively are we in terms of how are we positioned. So I think generally the view is that we are relatively more expensive, but but I think, I guess that's partly because of that is the reason why the informal sector has also really come up for that reason, to cater to this demand. Yeah, at the same time, I think a more recent discussion that's been going on has been with regard to this, the minimum room rates in Colombo City Hotel. So I think again there's some talk of whether they're going to remove it or not, because I think with the increasing competition, it kind of makes sense as well to, because I think that might be because if the rates are too high, I think that's going to like stifle this growth, even though a lot of capacity is coming in, even though there might be more interest. I think that's something they have to look at.
Okay. Also, Travis, talking about affordability, we also, another key segment to focus is the high spending tourist group.
Yes.
What would be the key strategies to attract them, and what can you give us an idea on that?
Yeah, again, I think this focus has to very much be on the experiential tourism and that aspect of it, because what we've seen is, and the sort of strategy that has been followed by the previous regime as well as the current government has to very much been, I mean, they've very much been focusing on like developing like the infrastructure, setting up these shopping precincts and these, big restaurant, areas and things like that. So, I mean, that sort of strategy has worked in some countries like Singapore and Hong Kong. But the thing is, that's something that requires a lot of capital expenditure, and it's going to take a long time for it to, materialize. So given our sort of existing, our problems with our external, our debt situation and things like that, that might not be the ideal strategy to follow. So actually what I would also recommend is to focus more on this kind of having sort of like this experiential tourism within Colombo, where you can basically, just by doing some incremental investments, you can reposition some of the attractions you have in Colombo to really increase the amount of earnings that you can get. So for example, something like the area around the fort, the PETA and all of that, I mean, you can make that like a walkable area and have like so many activities there. And same with a lot of the old historical sites here. You can have like walking tours and things like that. There's a lot of those kind of incremental investments you can do that really actually boost the earnings, and that's what really the tourists who are arriving here, and especially the high spending tourists, that's what's really attracting them, because they are not going to be impressed by any shopping malls or restaurants that you can get here, which they probably have much better stuff in Europe or where they're coming from. So I think those kind of creating those sorts of unique experiences is what you really need to focus on.
So the important aspect would be to create that unique experience.
Yeah, exactly.
Final thoughts, Travis. I mean, what would be your suggestions to take this industry forward and to make it sustainable?
Okay, yeah, so I think with regard to sustainability, apart from what I've said about experiential tourism, the other, as I said, one is with regard to these kind of these locations like Sigiriya, Yala, make sure that we basically have to take some effort to do that in a more sustainable manner, because I mean, one problem that seems to be there is in terms of overcrowding. So you need, one suggestion would be to sort of broad base that, because I think at the moment everyone's kind of focusing on these one or two locations, but actually if you take with regard to like the wildlife and the bird sanctuaries, I think there's only 3 of them account for more than 80% of the demand, while actually there's I think officially there's at least 20 to 30 these wildlife places which you can develop, and that would actually broad base the sort of the tourism as well, spread it out across the country. So I think you need to kind of market and position some of those other activities to make them more appealing. That's one aspect. And the other thing is, even the existing locations, kind of position it in a way so that it reduces this overcrowding. So for example, if you take Sigiriya, I think the way it's been structured, I mean, more or less what happens is people just basically drive up to the rock and they just basically start climbing it. But I mean, what you could do is, I mean, looking at that whole Sigiriya area, given that it has these the gardens at the bottom, you have those archaeological sites around it, you have this big a wildlife area. I mean, you can more or less develop into kind of almost like a theme park sort of thing, where and you can have so if you want to climb Sigiriya, you'd have timed access to it, things like that. So because what we've actually seen is that if you take Sigiriya, Polonnaruwa, Anuradhapura, actually in terms of the prices that they are charging for entry fees is actually quite high compared to like if you take like say the equivalent of Sigire you'd find in in Egypt, the pyramids or the Colosseum in Rome. Actually our prices are quite high, and despite that our revenue is actually quite low. So what we've seen is in a lot of these other attractions, they kept the prices low, but they've managed to actually cater to a much bigger audience as well. As a result, their overall revenue is much higher, and some of the research that we've seen, that's what is revealed by that. So I would say that I think sustainability is definitely something you need to focus on very significantly.
Yeah, I mean it's very crucial to focus on the sustainability of this critical sector.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Travis. It was a wonderful session, and we hope to see you soon with another episode to have an exciting discussion like this.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. And for viewers, hope you enjoyed the session, and we'll see you soon with another episode. Thank you.